In the summer of 2010, Motor Yacht Venture II, a Fleming 65, made the journey from Southampton in southern England to Iceland and back, a journey of some 5,000 miles. This video tells the story of the places and events we saw in and around the Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland. Our first stop was at the island of Jura. Distinctive peaks known as the Paps of Jura overlook Craighouse, the only village of any size on the island, which has a population of 200 people and 5,000 red deer. We anchored in Small Isles Bay. It was early spring, and the landscape was still cloaked in the umber tones of winter. The three main amenities in Craighouse are the distillery, the village store, and the hotel, from which there is a view of Venture framed by palm trees. The only road on the island is a single-track affair, which winds part way up the east coast and peters out well short of the northern tip. My great-grandfather was born on Jura and spent his early years at the isolated hamlet of Glengarrisdale on the northwest corner. We were now on our way to visit his childhood home. The anchor came up festooned with seaweed, which had to be cut away before we could move north, up the east coast on this stunning day. We passed Barn Hill, the house where, in 1948, George Orwell wrote his defining book, 1984. He nearly lost his life in the Gulf of Corryvreckan, the narrow passage with the notorious reputation that divides the northern tip of Jura from the next island of Scarborough. It was calm when we passed through, but even under these conditions, this treacherous body of water is prone to unpredictable upwellings. At its worst, the bizarre bottom contours produce whirlpools and standing waves as high as 20 feet, which can overwhelm the stoutest vessel. The roar from the resulting maelstrom can be heard 12 miles away. The underwater pinnacle of rock responsible for the turbulence shows up clearly on the depth finder. The cottage in which my great-grandfather lived is now a traveller's hut, known locally as a bothy. I had been hoping we could anchor in Glengarrisdale Bay, but the rocky bottom made this impossible. Chris held the boat offshore while I was able to land from the tender and visit the bothy. 7 years earlier, I had spent 3 days here, absorbing the atmosphere of the place where my great-grandfather had spent his childhood in the early 1800s. It had been a moving experience. Later in life he moved to Edinburgh, where he became a professor at the university and a poet in the Gaelic language. After my visit, we moved back north to a small bay just around the corner from Corryvreckan. The waters were turbulent on the approach, but it was calm within the anchorage itself. That evening we were treated to a magnificent Hebridean sunset. The following morning we set off south down the wild and deserted west coast of Jura. The bothy is the only habitable structure on the whole of this coast, and it looked very small and isolated against the backdrop of the mountains. We were headed for Loch Tarbot, a sea loch which penetrates the island and almost divides it in two. The approaches were quite tricky, with hazards that included rocks marked on the chart, but not on the water. We anchored within the second set of narrows. We appeared to be in a completely landlocked waters, with only the call of wild geese to disturb the silence. We launched the tender, and with Captain Chris at the helm, set out to navigate the innermost recesses of the loch, which had long been an ambition of mine. The way led through a narrow twisting channel, hidden from view until you were directly in line with the entrance. There are rocks in here too, and you must follow a series of leading marks to avoid the hazards. The upper basin is very shallow, except for one pool 60 foot deep. We were now less than 1 mile from the east coast of the island. An interesting feature is the raised beaches, some of which are over 100 feet above present sea level. The beaches date from the last ice age 10,000 years ago, when the land was covered in ice. As this melted, first the sea level and then the land itself rose. It was sobering to reflect that the pebbles beneath my feet were polished to their smooth shapes by waves which had crashed upon these very shores 10,000 years ago. We threaded our way back through the narrow channel and continued around the southern tip of Jura to complete our circumnavigation of the island. The paps were within sight all the way, and as they finally dropped astern, I wondered when I would next return.